Hi, I'm Maggie Mahaffey, and I'm here to talk about the chemical, anatomical, and psychological effects of the Juul. So let's get started by taking a look at how it all began. So the Juul was created on May 22nd, 2015, and its founders were Adam Bowen and James Monsies. Both of them were former cigarette smokers, and they used their educational backgrounds to create the Juul. They both attended Harvard, and they couldn't find a true alternative to smoking, so they created one. In a little bit further detail, today we're going to be talking about the Juul versus smoking cigarettes, the chemistry of the Juul ingredients and how they react inside and outside of the body, how the chemistry of the Juul affects the human anatomy, i.e. the respiratory and cardiovascular systems, how the chemistry of the Juul affects the psychology of the brain, and myths associated with Juuling. All right, so let's take a look at Juuls versus cigarettes. So one Juul pod is equivalent to one 20-pack of cigarettes. A pack of 4 Juul pods costs $15 to $20, while the average pack of cigarettes in the US costs about $10. In addition, the Juul has a sleek, compact design. It can fit in your pocket, it can fit in your purse, it could even fit in your wallet. While compared to cigarettes, you have to carry around either the big pack of cigarettes, which you can probably not fit into your wallet. In addition, Juuls leave behind no smoke scent, while cigarettes leave a smell in your clothes, in your car, in your house. This is why the Juul is more appealing than cigarettes. So let's take a look at a few quick facts before we get started on our main points. So far there are 12 deaths and 805 vape-related cases. A majority of the cases are related to those under 25, and a Juul pod contains 0.7 milliliters of nicotine per pod, which, as previously stated, is equal to one 20 pack of cigarettes. So for our first point, let's look at the chemical aspects of Juul. So let's start with their chemical ingredients: propylene glycol and glycerin, benzoic acid, nicotine, and diacetyl. In the next few slides, we'll be going over those more in depth. To begin with, propylene glycol and glycerin. Their intensive properties include they are clear, colorless, and odorless. They are used in other products such as makeup, medicine, and food as a water absorber and moisture maintainer. They also allow the lungs to absorb and maintain water, which can cause many adverse health effects. So benzoic acid, as you can see here, has 2 molecular formulas. So benzoic acid transforms into a liquid at 112.4 degrees Celsius and 250 degrees Fahrenheit. The most common form is a white crystalline solid. So in order to put it into a Juul pod, obviously they have to liquefy it, which means they have to heat it at a very high temperature. So when it reaches into the lungs, it transforms into a solid. Next, we have nicotine. In its pure state, it is colorless and odorless, but when in the presence of oxygen, it oxidizes and turns like a brown color. So nicotine has naturally occurring nitrogen-containing bases, which makes it an alkaloid. An alkaloid is a substance known to have both stimulating and relaxing properties. Other examples that you would know would be morphine, codeine, and caffeine. Lastly, nicotine has a half-life of about 2 hours in the human body. So lastly, we have diacetyl, and here is its molecular formula. So diacetyl is an ingredient used in popcorn and other food products. Its main function is to give a smooth, butter-like texture and flavor. Now let's talk about how these ingredients affect the body's chemistry. So let's talk about the GHS hazard statements for propylene glycol and benzoic acid. So GHS hazard statements are basically a way of classifying and labeling chemicals. So let's talk about propylene glycol. So it's a PGSTOTSE3 hazard, which means that it causes respiratory tract irritation, sore throat, and a cough. In addition, it's known to have narcotic effects such as dizziness and drowsiness. So moving on to benzoic acid. So it has GHS hazard codes of P260, P270, H315, and H372. So P260 states to not inhale the vapor. P270 says do not smoke around. H315 says known to cause skin corrosion and irritation. H372 means repeated exposure can cause organ damage. GHS hazard statements for nicotine are H300, deathly if consumed, H310, deathly if exposed to skin, H330, deathly if ingested, P260, don't breathe in, P270 don't smoke around the substance. Lastly, we have diacetyl, which has GHS hazard statements of H302, harmful if swallowed, H315, causes skin irritation, H331, dangerous if inhaled, and H373, repeated exposure can cause organ damage. We can conclude from the GHS hazard statements that smoking a Juul will cause adverse health effects. Now let's talk about the adverse health effects and how juuling affects the respiratory system. One of the adverse health effects is called popcorn lung. So popcorn lung is when the small air passages become irritated and swollen. The irritation then leads to scarring, which restricts the air passages and makes it hard to get enough air. The reason it is called popcorn lungs is because of the chemical diacetyl, which was used in popcorn manufacturing. Popcorn lung, as defined by WebMD, has a nickname of bronchiolitis obliterans. It is a condition that harms the lung's smallest airways. Side effects include coughing and shortness of breath. As previously mentioned, diacetyl has GHS hazard codes of H315, causes skin irritation, H331, dangerous if inhaled, and H373, repeated exposure can cause organ damage. So let's take a look at how organ damage takes place. So there are two zones in the respiratory system, the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. Both zones are affected by juuling, but popcorn lung predominantly affects the respiratory zone. Diacetyl is breathed in from the Juul, which then travels through your windpipe, which is also known as your trachea, which is this right here. So from your trachea, it splits off into two channels, which are called bronchi, which are these two channels right here. These two channels then lead to the right lung and the left lung. So inside of the lungs, the bronchiole here branch off inside of the lungs to form bronchial trees, which are these right here. The smallest of the bronchiole in a tree, which are typically the end ones here and ones like here, are called respiratory bronchiole. So these respiratory bronchiole, which are these the end smaller ones, connect to what we call alveolar ducts. So these alveolar ducts then open up into clusters of alveoli, which as you can see are these big balls right here. So looking at an enlarged picture here, from these alveoli, oxygen is then picked up by the blood. As previously mentioned, popcorn lung is when the small air passages become irritated and swollen. So if these small air passages, called the respiratory bronchiole, send oxygen through the blood, and if it's not being transported correctly, then that is what causes the irritation and the scarring, and that's what restricts the air passages and makes it hard to breathe. Now let's talk about how juuling affects the cardiovascular system. As previously mentioned, the oxygen is picked up by the blood, which contains the Juul pod ingredient. These ingredients are then carried by the blood throughout the rest of the body to the heart, and the heart pumps the blood throughout the rest of the body. So one of the main causes of certain things like vasoconstriction, which is just like veins, as you can see here, this is a normal vein, and this would be the blood. So vasodilation is when the vein is so enlarged, and vasoconstriction, which is what nicotine causes, is when the vein gets smaller. So if the veins are getting smaller, then it causes the heart to have a harder time pumping blood, which means you also have high blood pressure. In addition, nicotine is also known to cause your heart rate to increase by about 20 beats per minute. 20 beats per minute. So with all this pressure that's put upon the heart, you could end up getting heart disease. And in addition, if you are smoking and you have certain issues such as like a thick blood disease, then if you were to get a clot and you already had like vasoconstricted veins, then it would be easier for that clot to get caught. Now let's take a look at how juuling affects the brain psychologically. Let's begin with addiction. Almost 50 million people in the US are addicted to nicotine, meaning nicotine is the most common addiction in America. So let's take a look at how one develops an addiction to nicotine. So it all begins with the pleasure principle, which was created by Sigmund Freud, which basically says that, the brain has a natural disposition to look for pleasure and to shun pain in order to satisfy the biological and psychological needs. So this takes place in the nucleus accumbens, which is also known as the brain's pleasure center. So from there, when the lungs take in everything, and then the blood picks up the oxygen and the chemicals that were breathed in, and then it goes into the heart, and the heart pumps it throughout the rest of the body. You have nicotine acetylcholine receptors in your brain, otherwise known as alpha-4 beta-2, which connect to these the nicotine that was breathed in. So from there, dopamine is released. And it works with, which happens in the reward center, and it works with glutamate, which is in the planning center, to flood the nucleus accumbens and give a feeling of satisfaction. So, because you now have this feeling of satisfaction, it goes from liking to wanting, and the feeling of satisfaction is stored by the hippocampus as a memory of pleasure. So once your brain kind of stores this as, nicotine makes me happy, or nicotine makes me not feel as sad, and it's stored in your memory as a pleasure, then it goes to the amygdala for a stimulus response, and you get that kind of tingly sensation, or you feel happier, or you don't bite your fingernails as much, and that is how one becomes addicted to nicotine. So let's also take another look at some other areas that are associated with nicotine and juuling. So as we previously mentioned, the nucleus accumbens is known as the brain's pleasure center, which is where the dopamine and glutamate area kind of happens. In addition, the glutamate also works with the frontal cortex, which is known to have executive functions such as planning as well as attention. So the prefrontal cortex is one of the last areas known to develop. So the dopamine areas, which is your nucleus accumbens, your amygdala, which is this yellow little glob right here, and your hippocampus, which is function is to help with memory and stuff. So these areas here are essential in emotions and stuff like that. So the prefrontal cortex is said to not fully mature until the ripe age of 25. So say I am addicted to juuling, and every time I hit the Juul, it's when I'm sad, and I think that it's going to make me feel better. So my hippocampus stores this as a memory that when I'm sad, I hit the Juul. So my frontal cortex, not being fully developed, doesn't know how to handle emotions and stuff like that, because every time I look to handle my emotions, I hit the Juul, and it sends me a calming and stimulating response. So if the brain is still in the maturation process, which means typically under 25, and it associates nicotine as a form of, say, emotional support, then the brain can't learn to cope with emotions on its own. So this inability for the brain to cope on its own may lead to impaired mental health, which could ultimately be detrimental. So now that we've talked about these vaping illnesses, let's talk about some of the myths associated with vaping and why people are coming up about lies about the mysterious vaping illnesses. So according to the CDC, most of the cases are links to products containing THC. So what is happening is the products that were intentionally created, people are putting THC into which they're having to add certain additives such as vitamin E acetate oil, which is another type of oil which also isn't good for you to breathe in. And so since people are tampering with these original designs and they haven't really been tested, as well as other brands such as the Juul have, then they're creating more of a hazard, which is the reason we're seeing these mysterious vaping illnesses pop up. So just some last thoughts here. Juuling is a healthier alternative than smoking cigarettes, but it still doesn't mean that it is healthy for you. There is not enough data to conclude a definitive answer, so unless you want to be a test subject, it is recommended to stop or to never start Juuling. So today we talked about the chemistry of the Juul versus the cigarette, the ingredients inside and outside of the body, and the GHS hazard statements. Next, we talked about how the chemistry of the Juul affects the anatomy of the human body, i.e. the respiratory system and popcorn lung, and the cardiovascular system and high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, and vasoconstriction. Thirdly, we discussed how the chemistry of the Juul affects the psychology of the brain, and how there is a problem of addiction, how addiction works, and what areas of the brain addiction and nicotine affect. Lastly, we talked about the myths of vaping and how vapes themselves are not the main culprit, but tampering with original created devices. Just a word of encouragement, don't start Juuling because it will take over your life. If you have already started and you can't stop, I would encourage you to seek help. Thank you for listening.